So welcome to part 2 of our lecture corresponding to chapter 17. This one's actually pretty short and we'll be dealing in a bit more detail with the institution of slavery, which we touched on briefly. Having said that, I think it does, it's a pretty major topic and definitely deserves kind of its own space in this regard. And I mean, we really could explore it in much greater depth. There will be at least one other assignment dealing specifically with it. And in a survey course of this nature, it's kind of difficult to really to dig deep into any one topic in great depth. But certainly this one is worthy of that kind of scrutiny. In any event, though, to start with, we should note that when we talk about the institution of slavery in the New World context, we're talking about chattel slavery. And the reason I want to stress that is some of you might be aware that slavery as an institution has been with us pretty much since the beginning of history in many different societies. But the slavery that we see in the case of the New World, particularly in Brazil and then in the United States and in the British colonies, in some ways the worst manifestation of slavery throughout history. And that term chattel kind of really brings home the point. What it implies is that being a slave made you an outright possession of your master. Throughout history, in many cases, even if you were a slave, you were perceived as a human being, as having certain rights. Very often it wasn't racially based. There was a possibility of moving out of slavery or sometimes into it. In this case, a specific people on the basis of a very specific biological characteristic, skin color, are defined as somehow particularly suited for slavery, and as a slave, you are the outright possession of your master, meaning you're indistinguishable from any other kind of material possession. They can pretty much do with you as they will. You have no rights. And this is the form of slavery that is going to be predominant in the Americas, particularly in the case of the colonial and then American history in North America. And it should be noted, with the sanction of Christian authorities, very often using the Christian faith as a basis for justifying slavery. And I would argue that using very selectively certain verses from the Bible and so forth in a, shall we say, creative way in order to do this, but nonetheless, right? I mean, this kind of gave it for many Americans a seal of approval. And again, as a slave, you were a person that under the law had no legal rights. You had no control over your bodies, over your time, your labor, or your children. And in many respects, the predominance of chattel slavery reflects its kind of economic importance within these colonies, right? So you're going to have certain kinds of very labor-intensive kind of activities, particularly related to the growing of certain crops like tobacco and then especially cotton, that are very labor-intensive. And in order for them to be profitable, labor really has to come cheap, or in this case, without any cost at all. And particularly in South America, initially Europeans would have looked to the Native American population, but at some point their numbers had declined sufficiently due to disease and exploitation that they became more and more dependent on importing black slaves from Africa. And at some point, the number of black slaves will equal and then surpass the white European population in the major cities of South America and the West Indies, and then later on in North America. In North America, slavery really begins, the first importation of slaves begins with the settlement of Jamestown in 1619, which, by the way, I mean, that's really at the very beginning of English settlement of North America. And its economic importance is probably most evident in connection with the plantation, right? The cultivation of plantation crops, initially sugar in Brazil, tobacco in the British colonies, later on cotton. Again, very labor intensive, but in order to be profitable, that labor must come at minimal cost. By the end of the 17th century, by the way, the Caribbean islands had become the world center for sugar production, right? So, I mean, this was a tremendous source of wealth. And that meant importing more and more slaves. So related to that, the number of slaves really went up, right? By 1725, slaves constituted almost 90% of the population of Jamaica, right? So think about, if you're among that kind of 10% European white background, the political elite, you might start to perceive the demographics as a threat to your authority. And you're also very acutely aware of how dependent the whole economy that you're benefiting from is on slave labor. And all of this really becomes part of a much bigger kind of economic structure, the transatlantic economy. So you have the production of cash crops that are now geared towards external markets overseas. And then, this becomes the basis of accumulating wealth to buy manufactured goods entirely imported from Europe. So, even in Europe, people who are not directly tied to slavery, are not engaged in activities that require slaves, are indirectly dependent on slave labor. So that's going to generate a lot of political support on both sides of the Atlantic. And of course, part of the transatlantic economy is stopping off in Africa to pick up slaves that you can then sell in the Americas. Now, the life of a slave was absolutely miserable, right? So, and this is really worth stressing because every now and then you'll hear, within the media or political arguments, certainly not from any credible historians, that somehow, there were some positive aspects of slavery or it wasn't that bad. No doubt there was the occasional kind master, but even then, it's like you're entirely whatever benefit you might derive from your master is by sufferance. He might change his mind any given day, and in most cases, it didn't really go that way at all. And slaves had limited rights, and even if you had a kind master, right? I mean, you still very much your ability to be mobile within the larger society would have been heavily constricted. Right? At some point, because of the disproportionately large number of slaves vis-a-vis the white population, you're going to see a lot of legislation develop. The idea is to do everything to prevent the possibility of a slave revolt, but that really involves, really heavily restricting the movement of slaves, their ability to interact with one another and so forth. So even if you're treated somewhat kindly on your plantation, the minute you're off the plantation, all bets are off, effectively, right? And in any event, usually life was really, really awful on the plantation. Daily life, I mean, remember, the whole point is, the value of your labor and to exploit that as much as possible. Daily life was mostly about hard agricultural labor. And very often the kind of investment in slaves was minimal as evident in their poor diet and clothing, the fact that they very often had inadequate housing. So for instance, we know that there was a high death rate among slaves, right? So, all evidence is that generally speaking, slaves were treated very poorly. African slaves very often converted to Christianity. Certainly in the Spanish domains where they were made Catholic, in the English colonies very often converted to Protestantism, though in neither case did that seem to sufficiently humanize them that people might question the whole institution of slavery. And, while there might have been some benefits accruing from adopting the majority faith within the New World, depending, Catholicism or Protestantism, depending on where you were, for the most part, that was part of a larger process of losing any connection with your African roots, right? Most remnants of African culture were pretty much eradicated. Now, slaves did manage to maintain some African practices, though very often in muted form, right? So there was kind of, on the one hand, just, that these practices would change over time just by virtue of being in a new environment. But also you would be very reluctant to express them too overtly, as that might be viewed very unfavorably by your masters, right? And kind of tied to all of this were strong racial prejudices, right? Part of the justification for slavery of a particular people was tied to the idea that by virtue of coming from Africa, by virtue of the color of their skin, Africans were subhuman and therefore suitable to be slaves. And again, that is another very unique aspect of slavery in the New World. one aspect that you don't often come across, certainly not to that extent in other forms of slavery that have existed throughout history. The slave trade itself, of course, very profitable, initially dominated by the Portuguese, but then later joined by the Dutch, the French, and then the English. The 18th century was probably the high point of, in terms of Europeans engaging in the slave trade, right? The greatest number of slaves were shipped during the 18th century, and over the course of that century, you're talking about half of the total traffic in its entirety. Eventually, the British and the United States will outlaw the transatlantic slave trade in 1807 and 1808, respectively. But this hardly reflected some kind of epiphany about the wrongness of slavery. Slavery as an institution would continue. It probably had more to do with the concern about having too many, adding too much to a rapidly growing population. And it was perceived that, whatever Africans you had already in the New World could meet demand. Now, some people will point out that, the focus on Africans as slave in connection with the slave trade was not only evident in the New World. We have, that would be called the Occidental slave trade, Occidental meaning Western. You also have the Oriental slave trade, which began long before the 15th century and was directed much more at Islamic lands in the Middle East and Southern Asia. Though that was on a much lesser scale and much less onerous in the sense that, for instance, if someone converted to Islam, that might eventually see them liberated. They didn't stress the fact that the fact of their being racially African or having dark skin is somehow defining them as slaves and so forth. The Occidental slave trade can actually be traced back to the 13th century, beginning with sugarcane plantations on the island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean. But really, really taking off with the New World when they discovered how the local climate and soil was very suitable for, certain cash crops that, again, in order to be profitable, required minimal costs in terms of labor. So early on, the Portuguese are going to be at the forefront of the development of this plantation system of slave labor, which kind of goes hand in hand with the fact that they're at the forefront of the slave trade. It's under them that the source of slaves begins to move more into Western Africa. And initially, the source of slaves had been the savannas of the Sudan and the Horn of Africa, but then it's going to shift to the west. And by 1650, the Occidental slave trade of the Europeans is going to surpass the Oriental one directed at the Islamic lands. So this is definitely going to have a major impact on developments in Western Africa. First and foremost, in the sharp drain of its productive male population, right, as large numbers of young men are shipped off as slaves to the New World. But eventually it's also going to draw in certain individuals in West Africa who are able to profit from the slave trade, right? So some of this is going to see an increase in internal warfare in Western and Central Africa, right? So for instance, if two tribes go to war, the tribe that loses ends up many of its men end up being sold off as slaves to the Europeans. We're also going to see a rise in the internal market for female slaves, right? So that means that even after, like when the slave trade at the beginning of the 19th century directed at the New World is outlawed, you have enough individuals who are profiting from it who are simply going to keep perpetuating it, but looking for new markets, right? Either domestically with respect to the internal slave trade, or looking for new markets in the Orient, i.e. the Orient, the East, the Islamic lands from the Middle East onward. And connected with this also, we're going to see more of a focus on women as slaves, right? So the desired commodity moving forward will be indigenous African women. Eventually, the indigenous African trade in slaves will come to an end. It begins to decline at the end of the 19th century. Some of this, in fairness, it should be noted, reflects the influence of the European colonial powers, who by this point, many Europeans had decided that slavery was an evil institution, and so therefore tried to minimize or even eliminate it in territories in Africa that they brought under their control. Its ending, you could say, really begins where things really kind of start winding down in 1874 on the Gold Coast. and then finally coming to a conclusive end in 1928 in Sierra Leone. Here we see liberated slaves arriving back to Sierra Leone, having been sold to a market somewhere else. In any event, right, that's, really, by most estimates, the way short story of the institution of slavery, particularly as it pertains to the New World and the Americas. But as I mentioned, we'll be having at least one more exercise where we examine it in greater depth. In any event, that marks the conclusion of chapter 17.